of diaspora members across the international community, dedicated to giving the youth a leading voice in the celebration of 200 years since the Greek War of Independence. Throughout the upcoming year and celebration of this bicentennial, we'll be discussing various topics through verbal presentations and written articles. Our goal here really is not so much to provide a dissertation or an expert's opinion. Our goal really is to get as many people involved as possible. So our goal here is to really provide this high-level summary, serving as the beginning of the conversation. And our first topic is going to be how regions won the revolution. It will cover different regions of Greece and their individual contributions towards the overall Greek revolution. Discussing different regions really allows for the following benefits. It adds a personal touch to the discussion, since every member of the community can become invested in the role of their own region, their own choreo, and maybe even their own ancestry. It also weaves together a theme that multiple regions fought for the same cause. And though they weren't always organized, they weren't always similarly minded, maybe not even on the same page all the time, they each played a part in the ultimate victory of Greece and its establishment as an independent Greek state. Today in particular, we'll cover part one of this discussion, and we'll be discussing Macedonia. As chairman of the Sons of Pericles Cultural Committee and as co-chair of the Greece 200 Committee, I will be moderating. Our panelists here today are members of the Manhattan Sons of Pericles chapter. We have with us Andrew Cheretakis, who is one of our newest members of the New Renaissance chapter, and he works in the construction management industry. He is an assistant project manager for a New York-based construction company. We also have with us Emmanuel Candilas, who is one of the founding members of the New Renaissance chapter. He also sits as Lieutenant Governor of the District 6 Lodge, the New York State Sons of Pericles. And he's a software engineer for a startup based in Manhattan. So without further ado, Manny, why Macedonia? Why did the Manhattan Sons choose Macedonia as their topic?
Hi, Paul. Thanks for having us. There are a couple reasons why we chose Macedonia as our topic. The first is a personal one. I have family that is from the outskirts of Thessaloniki, a township called Kolindros. So it's very interesting to learn about this topic, as well as Thessaloniki was credited for a political and cultural renaissance in pre-revolution Greece, which is fitting given that our chapter in Manhattan is called the New Renaissance chapter. Paul, I think you're muted. Hello?
Paul, I think you're muted, Paul.
Still muted, Paul.
Thank you, Manny. Excuse me, I apologize for that, but we're having some technical difficulties here. Manny, that's all very well said, and I think it's great that we're doing this, and obviously for those great reasons. Now, Andrew, to add some context to this discussion, let's lay out the background of the Macedonia region. Can you describe the geography of the region and relevant locations we'll be discussing?
Yeah, sure. And thank you guys for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. But Macedonia as a whole covers most of northern Greece, and it's broken down into Western, Central, and Eastern Macedonia. So generally, the revolutionary activities took place in Western and Central Macedonia, with Western Macedonia extending south to Mount Olympus and west to Epirus, while Central Macedonia mainly includes Thessaloniki, Ceres, and the Halkidiki Peninsula and Mount Athos. So the relevant locations we'll be discussing mostly tonight are Central Macedonia, including the cities of Thessaloniki and Ceres, were slightly farther north in Central Macedonia, while most of the revolutionary activities took place in the Halkidiki Peninsula. The peninsula looks like a hand with three fingers, with the left finger being the region of Cassandra and the right finger extending to Mount Athos, the famous cluster of monasteries. So Western Macedonia extends to Mount Olympus and west to Epirus. It includes cities of Naousa and Veroa and is a largely mountainous area.
Thanks, Andrew. I think we've solved all of our technical difficulties now. I was actually hearing the stream and the recording at the same time, so it was a little bit hard in the studio room here at the Pavlakos household to get everything on, but we are back on track. Andrew and Manny, thank you for keeping us rolling for a little bit. And we have the geography laid out. Let's add some further background to that, Andrew. What was the atmosphere of the region before the revolution? What were the demographics and the cultural environment really leading up to 1821?
So the region was still mostly Greek, but in many areas, specifically the urban centers, they had a large Muslim and Jewish population, creating a relatively diverse community. Economically, the region was thriving. The first major Russo-Turkish War occurred in the 1700s, and at the end of it, there was a Treaty of Kenarji that allowed Greek commercial ships to sail freely as long as they were under the Russian flag. So it also allowed Greek ship owners to own larger ships. This led to the advancement of maritime trade in the area. So the economic advancement correlated politically and culturally with a deeper sense of Hellenism. So this was shown by an interest in a community of Greeks and donations and gifts to restore Greek churches throughout the area. So it was clear at that time that the ideals and patriotism of Rigas Ferias had made a big impact on the Thessalonians, and their desire for Greek liberation was strong. Even before the Philaki Etiria had formed, the region showed strong revolutionary sentiment, and by the Russo-Turkish War in 1806 to 1812, a large amount of the Christian population was mentally prepared for a possibility of a revolution.
So, Andrew, we've set the stage now. Manny, we come now to the beginning of the revolution. When did it reach Macedonia, and who was involved originally?
Right. So like the rest of Greece, revolutionary activities started in the spring of 1821, but the timing was not planned. It was very sporadic. The main figure involved there was one Emmanuel Papas, the gentleman behind me. He was a merchant, lender, banker from Ceres. His enterprise was actually beyond the region of Greece throughout Europe. He was inexperienced in military affairs, but he was a strong patriot, and he found himself in Constantinople in 1817, fleeing persecution by one Yusuf Bey, also of Ceres. It was actually in Constantinople where Papas was initiated into the Philikiateria, which was very common for other Macedonian rebels at the time to be initiated outside of the region in Macedon. So this included areas like Central or Eastern Europe, Russia, and as the aforementioned Constantinople. By March of 1821, Papas used his own money and he bought arms and other supplies and sailed for Mount Athos.
And Manny, why Mount Athos?
Papas and other revolutionaries thought that it would be best to start, it would be the best place to start the revolt in Macedon. Geographically, it was a mountainous region and it had a lot of natural defenses, and it was located right at the edge of the Halkidiki Peninsula, making it a strategic location to push north and eventually into Thessaloniki. Politically, it had status as a monastery, so it was one of the few areas without a Turkish garrison. So revolutionary leaders believed that the monks would be supportive of a revolt, given their patriotism and also some abuse by the same Yusuf Bey, both financial and physical.
So at the time, it seemed like they had intentions, they had motivation. It seemed like a good strategy at the time. Now, once he lands at Mount Athos, though, what was the strategy from there?
So we have some letters communicating between Cassandra and Mount Athos, and they tell us that the early plan was to cause a simultaneous revolt. So the strategy here is interesting because of the geography of Halkidiki. The peninsula is set up like three fingers. So Cassandra is the farthest left and Mount Athos is the farthest right. So the intent was to revolt in both areas and to push up of each side of the peninsula and meet in northeast Halkidiki and unite and then march on Thessaloniki from there. The people of Cassandra did revolt towards the end of May, while simultaneously Greeks in Polygoros, is a center of Halkidiki, fought off attacks of Turkish forces and continued to ambush a little farther north in modern-day Bayokastro. The two forces coming from Cassandra and Polygoros did manage to unite and made their way to within hours of Thessaloniki.
So, Manny, this actually paints a pretty promising picture so far at the outset. It looks like the Greek forces are doing well. They've advanced. There's some uniting here. They've won a little bit, but we know how this ends. We know it was overall unsuccessful. So it begs the question, really, what went wrong?
Well, the common theme throughout the war on both sides was a lack of organization. Like we mentioned earlier, Papas himself was passionate, but he was green, he was inexperienced. And the forces fighting the revolution were generally undisciplined and didn't really have a central commander. So many different groups were fighting in parallel, but not in a coordinated effort. Then there was obviously the lack of ammunition and supplies. All of these resources were scarce. We'll discuss this a little bit later, but Papas had actually sent many requests to the famed Ypsilantis in southern Greece for supplies, but those requests were mostly unfulfilled. By early summer of 1821, Bayram Pasha, who had been sent by the Sultan from Asia Minor to put down the revolution in Greece, reached central Macedonia and attacked the revolutionary forces. He and his soldiers forced most of the revolutionary forces in the area to flee, with some of them escaping to the mountains and Papas and his men fleeing back to the peninsula of Cassandra. At this time, many of the women and children fled to Mount Athos, where they were actually sheltered as refugees. And this marks the first time in history that the Mount Athos broke the rule of forbidding women access to the mountain.
Interesting. Now we've focused really so far on Cassandra and Mount Athos and Halkidiki, but there were other areas in central Macedonia, of course, plenty of large cities, plenty of other areas within the region. Andrew, were any of those greatly involved in these initial efforts?
So, as Manny mentioned earlier, Mount Athos and Cassandra really did become the center of the early revolution in central Macedonia. There were some other revolutionary actions like the island of Thasos, but a lot of the other areas refused to participate, either because of lack of organization created a doubt for success, or because they were afraid of potential retribution from the Ottoman Empire. So, as an example, Ceres was preparing for a revolution in 1821 as well, and this was led by Metropolitan Chrysanthos, who later became the Patriarch. But the later hanging of Patriarch Gregory V on Easter Sunday in 1821 deterred them, and even though Papas tried to urge them to fight, they remained mostly passive from then on.
So, Andrew, you bring up the infamous hanging of Patriarch Gregory V of Constantinople. What, in general, was the Turkish reaction once revolution started to spread in Macedonia?
So, I'll preface this by saying that during war times, there were lots of unjust violence and atrocities that occurred from both sides. So jumping ahead just a bit, when the uprising was beginning in Noisa, in Western Macedonia, an assembly of Greek townspeople rushed out into the market square and slaughtered a number of Turkish merchants. So there was definitely some Greek soldiers and militia that weren't innocent. But the Turkish response was often unjustified and disproportionate. Yusuf Bey seemed to become more harsh as the revolution spread, imprisoning hostages, then slaughtering them, and eventually cornering them and killing men on the streets of Thessaloniki. At times, refugees hiding in the churches were slaughtered, and the churches were turned into prisons. So even people of Ceres who were mostly passive were stripped of their goods and weapons, and many, including Chrysanthos, were imprisoned. So one of the malas, which back in that day was a high-ranking judge, described that every day and every night you hear nothing in the streets but shouting and moaning. So as you could imagine, a very sad era.
Yeah, and like you said, obviously, events on both sides, but really the systematic atrocities that we see here, something worth looking into. Of course, the Sons of Pericles have been very involved over the last few years in the Greek genocide efforts to recognize what happened in the early 20th century. And, obviously the revolution was 100 years earlier, but we see similar concepts, this anti-Christian sentiment, this systematic destruction, as opposed to the kind of haphazard destruction you normally see during a war. This seemed very symptomatic, some of this. You mentioned the people of Ceres, even though they were passive, weren't spared. Their passiveness did not spare them at the time, which today would be arguably a war crime or a genocide in itself had the legal term existed back then. So very, very sad time, as you mentioned, Andrew, a horrible time. These atrocities definitely something to look into, definitely something to discuss and maybe research further. But Manny, getting back to the progression of the revolution itself, at this point, it's late summer of 1821. Papas has fled from Polygoros, central Halkidiki, back to Cassandra. It seems at this time that Bayram Pasha really eliminated the forces in central Macedonia. At this point, what comes next?
Well, at this time, the revolution had taken hold in southern Greece. So Dimitrios Ypsilantis was in Peloponneso and had frequent communication with both Papas and other leaders. And as a leader of the revolt and a member of the Filiki Eteria, known by some, I don't know if we mentioned, the Society of Friends or Friendly Society, I urge you all to look it up. It was around this time that the leaders of the Greek Revolution started trying to unite the efforts of each region and cause a coordinated initiative. Ypsilantis knew that the revolution in Macedonia was having difficulties. It wasn't exactly a secret. But once again, he was unable to provide material support. So as consolation, he appointed Papas as the leader and governor of Mount Athos, Cassandra, and Thessaloniki, hoping to strengthen Papas's standing as the leader of the revolution in that region and sort of give him some credibility. So it was around this time that Ypsilantis, Papas, and the others really began to focus on Western Macedonia, in particular the region around Mount Olympos, as the beginning of a new revolutionary effort trying to revive the region's revolution. Interestingly, Ypsilantis focused on the western part of his strategy to coordinate and place particular emphasis on Nausa, because it had a large stockpile of arms and ammunition, as we know is scarce. So Papas, on the other hand, tried to inspire an uprising in the West, but it served more of the purpose of causing a diversion, as he hoped to increase their prospects of, as he hoped to increase their forces in the area, and get some more of them to travel to Cassandra. But either way, both leaders saw value in the Western Macedonian Revolution.
Yeah. And you bring up an interesting point, Manny, just to expound on that. I think it's a valuable lesson too. You have two people in Papas and Ypsilantis who their intentions were different in focusing on Western Macedonia. Even then, I wouldn't call it on the same page by any means. One saw it for its forces, one saw it for its diversions, but their intentions still allowed them to move in parallel towards a similar goal, at least, and it's something that can be valued. If you can't align perfectly, at least you can get in the same direction. So we start to see that now towards the end of the activity in Eastern and Central Macedonia, and I think that kind of carries us into the activity picking up in Western Macedonia. So Andrew, will segue that into you. We get into Western Macedonia. How did the early situation in Western Macedonia compare from Central and East?
So Western Macedonia also had its issues. There was a large amount of Turkish forces already in that area due to Ali Pasha's mutiny in Epirus years earlier. And the Filiki Eteria, despite wanting to promote revolution, hadn't provided any material support or organization yet. So that serves as an issue. What the West did have was an advantageous geography with large mountains, dense forest, and lots of streams providing hideouts for Kleftes and Amatorli to hide out.
So we finally get to the famous Amartoli, the Kleftes that we all hear about. Who were they, Andrew, the Amartoli, and why were they so instrumental?
So initially, the Amartoli were a military force appointed by the Ottomans to keep the Kleftes in check. So this was a heavy strategy used by the Turks to keep control over areas that they had a hard time accessing, such as Western Macedonia, due to its mountainous and rough terrain. So over time, the Amartoli and Kleftes developed a cooperative relationship, and then they became indistinguishable. So a lot of Amartoli left the Ottoman forces and began fighting for the revolution. This was greatly beneficial because their time in the Ottoman forces meant that they were already well armed. So also they preserved old martial art traditions and martial ethos and had a lot of experience in fighting tactics and techniques. So even though they faced some of the same disorganization challenges, they were very well trained in the art of war and in less of a need of a central commander.
And just will, of course, this is different regions, but I can't help but bring up martial traditions, martial ethos, certain things that carries with us that we use today, and will certainly, as the year goes on, be discussing the concept of martial ethos, the military mindset, really, as another way to phrase it. So just as we did for Eastern and Central Macedonia, Andrew, let's describe the early stages of the revolution with that region. Who was involved? How did they approach this uprising?
So taking a step back, even in the summer of 1821, there were sentiments in the area for a revolution. Diamantis Nicolaou, who was an Amatoli and would later be a revolutionary leader in the area, was strongly enthusiastic about the prospects for a revolution. But others didn't share that same feeling. Diamantis wrote a letter to Papas that summer saying that the leaders in Olympus are not as you may think in their conduct is Turkish or neutral at best. Like in other areas of the region, fear of retribution and a strong concentration of Turkish forces made a lot of people unwilling to fight, unfortunately. Finally, though, that September, Diamantis and others prepared to revolt. They wrote a letter to Papas announcing their intentions and sent Nicholas Gasamoulis, a merchant and Intida member, to the Peloponnese to ask Espiritandas for supplies. We've seen this before. Ypsilantis, despite strongly promoting the uprising in the area, didn't provide material support, but instead referred the envoy to Hydra and Septis for help. And once again, as consolation, appointed an officer, Gregarios Salos, as commander-in-chief in the Macedonian revolutionary forces.
So at this time now, it's fall 1821. Ypsilantis is clearly, he cares about Macedonia, but is either unable or doesn't care enough to send supplies at the time. He's pushing kind of the obligation off to Hydra and Spetses, which were very instrumental islands, different regions that were helpful in the revolution. But let's jump back, Manny, really to Eastern and Central Macedonia. Papas is still in Cassandra. How did he respond to this renewed effort in Western Macedonia?
Kasomoulis is in Peloponnesus, right? And he's requested by Ypsilantis to send a letter to Papas. And that letter asks Papas to leave Cassandra and march on Olympus and to coordinate with them on their efforts. So Papas just couldn't bring himself to leave the area defenseless. So he stayed in Cassandra and ignored the orders. So Cassandra's final defenses came in October of that year. Yusuf Bey, who was still oppressing efforts in Thessaloniki and other areas, appointed Mehmed Emin Pasha as the commander of a large force, and that Mehmed marched 3,000 men to Cassandra, and after several attempts, broke through on October 30th and took control of the peninsula. At this time, many people fled the region to various islands like northern Sporades, an island of Skiathos, and Skopelos or Psara or Hydra. And Papas himself went back to Mount Athos. But once he got there, he saw the defeated nature of the monks and their desire to submit. So he just up and left to Hydra himself, or Hydra. It was on this trip to Hydra that he died of a heart attack on December 5th, of 1821, and he never quite made it to the island. Shortly thereafter, Mount Athos and the other areas in the region surrendered to the Ottomans. Mehmed Emin started demanding payments from the Greeks and imprisoned those who didn't pay. And actually, others have even said that those who did pay weren't spared from the plunders and slaughtering that happened in the area. And churches were stripped of their rich ornaments, and priests and other hostages were killed. While there were still some sporadic attacks here and there, this was largely the end of the revolution in Eastern and Central Macedonia.
And with these efforts eliminated, really only Western Macedonia still had active fighting at the time. So Andrew, what's the situation in Western Macedonia to kick back as they became really the last hope of that region?
So we've mentioned already that there was a lot of emphasis on the Western strategy placed on Naousa. This was solidified in early 1822 when the two leaders, Karatzos and Gatsos, called a meeting at the notable regional leaders at Dorva Monastery. It was here that they united the two warring families of Naousa, Zafikis and Mamantis. They also decided that this meeting that Noosa would be the center of the revolution in Western Macedonia. Soon after, Western Macedonia finally got the supplies it had been requesting for months. In February, Camusalus returned from the Peloponnese and brought with him gunpowder and supplies. A few weeks later, Salas, who was promoted to commissioner of Macedonia after Pappus's death, landed at the same port. He brought additional supplies and some reinforcements, including a group of German Philhellenes that would end up taking the charge of the cannons in that area during the fights.
And again, we'll see lots of activity from Philhellenes as we progress through these revolutionary conversations. But so far, Andrew, really in Western Macedonia, we've seen a lot of preparation for the efforts, but at what point did action actually take place?
So the beginning of this new uprising was when Diamantis attempted to take the town of Golindros from Turkish forces. An interesting note here is that the attack on Golindros was aided by the cannons that had been placed by the German Philhellenes that arrived in early March. So unfortunately, these efforts were quickly defeated, and loss after loss forced Diamantis and his forces to withdraw from Golindros, then soon after to Milia. This is where the Turks attacked on Easter Sunday, 1822. Fighters ended up locking themselves in a tower with women and children. It was after this that villages around Olympus were burned down and people fled. They fled the region. Some trekked across snowy mountain ranges and headed south, including the German Philhellenes, while Diamantis and others left for Noosa to help in those efforts.
Now, Manny, real quick, actually, did you say your family's from Golindros? If I heard you right at the beginning. So this is why we discuss these things, right? Is because we're talking about the Chorio that your family's from, and like we said, it's all Greek, it's all part of one nation and one community. But really, when you get into the specific Chorio, there's a certain personal tie there that you just can't beat, and you learn about your own potentially ancestry on things that occurred at that time. So just a cool point and a very, very interesting topic to discuss for sure. And Andrew, as the Diamantis is leaving for Nausa, now happening in parallel before the Diamantis even gets there, Nausa already had revolutionary activity, right? What was happening in Nausa before the Diamantis even arrived?
So activity in Nausa began with what we mentioned earlier, was actually one of the slaughters committed by the Greek forces. Zafarikis had called a meeting of the townspeople with the help of Canusis, who came from the Peloponnese with Salas and his men. So he gave the speeches on freedom, liberation, escaping the hardships suffered under the Turks. So the people were inspired and rushed the market square, killing many innocent Turkish merchants and officials. Zafarikis and Canusis were distressed at this, and it seemed that they weren't condoned as a matter of policy. Regardless, these forces set out the next day to capture the town of Feroya, an important Turkish military base. But the Turks were forewarned about the attack, told by Mamantis clan and other rival families. The Turkish forces repelled Zafarikis and his men, for the first time casted doubt on the people's hope in Noosa.
So, Andrew, it seems already at this point that Western Macedonia is heading towards a similar fate as other areas in the region. Hopes have been diminished. They are losing battles, and sometimes because of the betrayal of other Greeks, which is always terrible to see. But what was the final blow in that region?
The final blow was after the defeat in Feroya. Garatsos, Gatsos, and others went on the defensive in Noosa and built up strong defenses in that area. Mehed Emin sent the deputy to take Noosa, and the two sides fought at the Dobra monastery, where the Greek religious leaders originally met to plan the revolution. The Greek forces won this battle, and optimism grew, especially since that was the time that Diamantis arrived in Noosa, now that the fighting in Olympus was over. But in April 1822, Mehed Emin came to Noosa himself to direct the attack. He brought 20,000 troops and launched assaults for weeks before breaking through into the town. Diamantis and others escaped the town Sophocles. Garatsos and Gatsos fled to the southwest over the mountains, and Zafikros took refuge in a town near Arabasta for 3 days, which allowed others there to escape before fleeing himself. Nearby at the waterfall of Stamanti, near Aparista, 13 young women threw themselves off the waterfall to avoid being taken by Turkish forces.
And we bring this up, of course, near Arapizza, because it really, for those who are familiar with Greek dance, is very reminiscent of the dance of Zalongo, where the women of Epirus in 1803 threw themselves off a cliff rather than being taken by the Turkish forces, and it became a very popular dance, which most likely dance groups and churches across the international community will likely be dancing around March 25th celebrations in 2021. So we see here a little bit of a repeat of this self-sacrificing nature, this death over imprisonment and this freedom at the risk of death philosophy that we're seeing here. So at this point, this really marks the end of the large-scale revolutionary efforts in Macedonia. But Manny, how did the later years of the revolution play out in Macedonia? Once the leaders fled, what happened to them?
Well, even though the holistic and formal revolution ended, the Armatolis still led some periodic attacks. Also, many of the refugees and leaders continued fighting on behalf of the revolution in southern Greece, and even found themselves outside of Greece in Moldova and Wallachia. By 1827, when the First Hellenic Republic was created, Kapodistrias was appointed governor. The Amantis had also returned to Olympos multiple times to try to rekindle a revolution. But he'd expected support from the national government at that point and received none. Kapodistrias relied on the opinions of other European powers, who at that point were instrumental in the success of the revolution, and they didn't want a new Greek-Turkish front. They'd become sympathetic to the cause from all the tabloids, so to speak. So receiving no support, the Amantis abandoned the revolution in Olimpo and decided to settle in Free Greece. Probably something we can all relate to, the Amantis never lost his spirit or nostalgia for home. Even what was possibly his final letter in December of 1855, he said, powerful read, I regret the following. Firstly, I do not feel that much sadness for my wife and underage children. I place my hopes in the common father of the Greeks, the Honorable King Otto, and their defenses by friends against misfortune. The second, though, saddens me greatly. I will not see this great war to its conclusion. The third grieves me to my heart. I will not see the land of my birth free, the land where so much blood had been shed on my account when carrying the revolution.
Thanks, Manny. I know personally when I read that letter, I thought it was inspiring, saddening, really, but a very powerful read to see, a person who really maybe didn't die during revolutionary activities, but gave their life to the revolution, dedicated their life to see the freedom and liberation of Greece. And even though he saw it in certain areas, he didn't get to see it in his home of Macedonia until much later. And just to add a bit of context, because we discuss at that time fleeing to free Greece. So when we say free Greece, what do we mean by that? Well, it's the result of the fact that the First Hellenic Republic, of course, we know the borders of modern day Greece, but the First Hellenic Republic was much smaller than the Greece that we have today. The borders really only extended to the Artavolis line in central Greece, but they wouldn't extend north to Macedonia until much later. They extended into Thessaly in 1821, sure, but then Macedonia and Epirus, or 1881, excuse me, was much later. And then Macedonia and Epirus were not marked as part of Greece until after the Balkan Wars in 1913-14, which is, a little more than 100 years ago only. So we don't really see this concept of free Greece and Macedonia until much, much later. And that fact, clearly somebody like the Amandis, who dedicated their life to this revolution, must have really saddened him more than anything. It's understandable and relatable. So I think that's a great letter to read. Right? So we'll wrap up this segment a little bit here. Let's come full circle. Our purpose, we said, is how regions won the revolution. What was their cause? Here, it seems like Macedonia didn't necessarily win the revolution, but the point is every region played a part in winning in the ultimate victory, Right. So what was Macedonia's impact on the rest of the war? Even though it was unsuccessful itself, how did it play a part in the ultimate victory of the Greek War of Independence? Andrew, we'll kick it off with you.
So, like we alluded to, the main impact that the Macedonian refugees never actually stopped fighting. Those who fled continued to fight from northern Sporades Islands and southern Greece, and even made periodic attacks in Macedonia, which kept a constant fear of the revolutionary revival in the minds of the Ottomans. Later on, Macedonian refugees actually became the first-class source of manpower that led all the Greek forces to draw on throughout the war.
And Manny, what do you think was the impact of Macedonia and the revolution?
Well, even the early efforts in Macedonia had benefits. Strategically, Bayram Pasha was sent from Asia Minor to put down the revolution in southern Greece and Peloponneso, but he needed to tie himself up and attack Halkidiki and delayed his arrival to the south. This gave the southern forces more time to form themselves, prepare, get resources, and build the revolution up. Additionally, politically, one British diplomat stated that the events of Macedonia, including the slaughters and hostage-taking, helped shape the European opinion of the Ottoman Empire in the area. And this may have partially led to their eventual aid on the war on the Greek side. This includes monetary aid from England, from Britain at the time.
Great. Yeah. So, I mean, both Andrew and Manny, we see that even though, again, the revolution in that region may not have been ultimately successful, there were certainly impacts that spread around the rest of Greece and even to the rest of Europe, that really Macedonia was a part of that ultimate win, that ultimate victory that we see, and the ultimate establishment of modern Greece. So the both of you, as a closing question, this entire presentation, we've seen, I have to ask, these virtual backgrounds that we see here. Let's go ahead and have you each explain what your virtual backgrounds signify. We'll go ahead and start with you, Andrew.
So mine is a Halkidiki flag. And according to some oral history, the yellow rooster symbolizes the awakening of the nation. But more likely, and according to several museum exhibits in Macedonia, the flag is the same as the naval revolutionary flag in Hydra, given the communication and cooperation of the two regions at the same time. The blue with red border signifies the river of bloodshed. The cross stands for faith in the law of struggle. The inverted crescent represents the fall of the Ottoman Empire. The spears and the anchor symbolize the stability of the fight. And the winding serpent signifies the sanctity of the cause. The owl represents wisdom with which the fight must be conducted.
Thanks, Andrew. For me, it's interesting. Everything means something, right? And so each of those images we see in that Halkidiki flag is, of course, coordinating with Hydra, as we see a lot in this time. But the symbolism, really, everything means something. Every one of those pieces has a certain part of symbolism. And Manny, what about you? What is your virtual background?
Oh, this is just used to hide the mess in my room. Don't worry about it. Just kidding. This is a statue of the great Emmanuel Papas, and this is located in his birth town of Ceres in Greece. And according to the memorial, which is cut off underneath me here, it contains his remains, which were transported from Hydra during the building of the statue much later in the 70s, 1971. Roughly translated, the inscription reads, "A child of Ceres in the war against tyranny. He was a salvation of glorious Greece and acquired glory. He died unexpectedly, and his remains were held in Hydra. He gave his soul to the heavens."
Thanks, Manny. Well, that concludes our presentation, part one of how regions won the revolution, covering Macedonia. Join us next week, October 28th, for part two at 7 p.m., same day next week, same time. This will be a presentation by the Greenville Sons of Pericles chapter in South Carolina, and we'll be discussing something that you guys alluded to a lot, was the island of Hydra, right? Halkidiki flag, inspired by Hydra. Emmanuel Papas fled to Hydra. Hydra was referred to as a constant source of support for the Macedonian region. So next week, we'll focus on Hydra specifically as an island and what it meant for the revolution. So we'll get through these. Couple weeks after that, we'll have Mani and Laconia on November 11th, and then we'll present some different topics, verbal and written, again throughout the year as we Greece 200 and Sons of Pericles celebrated the bicentennial of modern Greece. Thank you everyone for watching.
Yes, thank you for
Thank you
attending.
for having me, Paul.